The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 30 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Have you ever heard about the busibody New Englander? You know, that person who knows all about their neighbor's private affairs? This stereotype comes from the New England town church ideal. New Englanders established towns and placed churches at their center because they believed that ministers and congregants had a responsibility to maintain civic and moral order within their town. This ideal became ingrained in New English culture, and New Englanders attempted to replicate this ideal in nearly every town and settlement they established. After the American Revolution, thousands of New Englanders moved north to lands in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. They hoped to establish a new life in these frontier areas. However, the migrants proved unable to recreate the town church ideal as the geography of northern New England promoted small towns and scattered settlement. Most northern New England towns had neither the population nor the money to establish and maintain a town church. Which brings us to this question. How did they establish and maintain civic and moral order in their new northern New England towns? Shelby M. Balick, Assistant Professor of History at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and author of Rally the Scattered Believers, Northern New England's Religious Geography, joins us to explore the post-revolution New England migration into northern New England and the migrants' attempts to establish churches and moral order in their communities. During our exploration, Shelby reveals the religious landscape of northern New England after the War for Independence, what the New England town church ideal was and why it proved ill-suited to the geography of northern New England, and information about the Second Great Awakening and what caused this period of religious revivalism during the early 19th century. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Shelby M. Balick.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Shelby M. Balick is an assistant professor of history at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. She specializes in the history of American religion and has a keen interest in how early Americans experienced religion in their everyday lives. Shelby's book, Rally the Scattered Believers, Northern New England's Religious Geography, explores how the shifting landscape of early Republic New England gave rise to new kinds of spiritual communities and identities. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Shelby.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Today, you are going to lead us on an exploration of northern New England and how the people living there formed religious communities between the 1780s and 1850s. But before we embark on our journey, would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in early American religious history and northern New England?
Sure. In my first professional life, I was a high school teacher, and I gravitated, when I decided to go to graduate school to get a PhD in history, I gravitated to what I had always loved to teach. And one of the areas that I really loved to teach was religion, any kind of religion. I taught American history and world history. And I also really, really enjoyed teaching early America. To me, early America really just feels like another world. The social categories are different, the political identities are very murky and fluid, and the ways in which politics and religion and social life intersect have always fascinated me. And so that's how I kind of gravitated there. Now, when I was in college and then when I was in graduate school, I read works like Martha Ballard's Midwife's Tale and Alan Taylor's Liberty Men, and I was fascinated with the region because of those books. And I thought it deserved more study. So I worked on a northern New England topic, or at least partly northern New England topic, for my MA project, which was not the same as what later became my dissertation. But while I was doing the research for that project, I came across a stack of missionaries' journals. And they were just they blew me away, because the missionaries were describing this world that looked through their eyes to be anarchy, chaos, barefoot Methodists running around and stealing people away from the churches and on and on. And as it turned out, I barely used those sources at all in my MA thesis, but I couldn't stop thinking about those journals. And that's really where the seed for the book was planted, with those missionaries' diaries. And it just sort of led me down the rabbit hole that became my dissertation and then the book.
That's how all dissertations get started, don't they? You have this question and you just can't leave it alone.
Exactly. Too good to put down.
Let's begin our exploration by discussing the terrain.
Okay.
Rally the Scattered Believers considers how ministers and lay people remapped northern New England's religious geography. Shelby, would you provide us with an overview of the physical and religious geography of northern New England after the War for Independence? And would you define what northern New England is for us?
Absolutely. Northern New England is New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And this region was very chaotic, and the social circumstances and contexts were very fluid after the American Revolution. Just going state by state, Maine was sort of a backwater province of Massachusetts, and it would become its own state in 1820, as many of your listeners probably know. But until then, it was living under Massachusetts law, especially, including religious law, despite developing a very different culture and a very different economy. It was also very much a frontier. The population was mostly in the down east section, hugging the coastline, but much of Maine was this huge, sparsely populated wilderness to the north. As for New Hampshire, it had been its own entity, its own colony, and then its own state, of course, since the late 17th century. But it, too, was very minimally populated, really with the population clustering in the southern towns and then along the Connecticut River. Vermont was the site of this mini civil war that happened as the revolution was breaking out between New York and New Hampshire over some contested land grants. And so even though it wrote its first territorial constitution in 1777, its status was very much up in the air for some years. It, too, was very sparsely settled beyond the land in the southern end of the region and then also up the Connecticut River Valley to some extent. All the towns were chartered by land grant in Vermont. And so they existed, but they existed only on a map. If you actually look town by town, you'll see that a lot of them, especially in the north, especially in the mountainous regions, were unpopulated. And so all across the region, there were relatively few organized towns and even fewer organized churches. But as of the end of the American Revolution, these places were about to get a rush of new people looking for somewhere where they might earn a living. Now, okay, so how does that physical geography really mesh with religious geography? Religious geography is an underlying idea in this book, and I define it as how people in religious communities organize themselves across space, how the physical layout of people and institutions sort of gave way to these new understandings of community and identity. And I think about religious geography in two senses, the physical sense and the spiritual sense. The physical geography of religion has to do with how people interact with physical spaces. So what I mean by that is, how did the layouts of towns and the borders between them affect church life? How did the actual topography, the mountains, the access to rivers, where the roads were, affect religious community? How did denominations deal with distance between churches and parishioners, right? What paths did missionaries take, and how far did they go, and what physical obstacles did they encounter, right? So that's the physical geography of religion. And then the spiritual geography is this other side, and that's really more about how people perceive the space. So what was the relationship between town and church and religious community? How did people forge spiritual relationships across distance? How did they use devices like print and reading and writing and new kinds of religious rituals to create these communities that may have connected people that they would never, ever meet in person? Northern New England in the early Republic posed a lot of challenges as a physical space, right, which is mountainous and a lot of really craggy mountains and very narrow roads and these streams that are not really navigable. So it's a challenging space to settle and forge community. And so it seemed to me, when I was approaching the study to begin with, that it was a perfect backdrop for the study of the spatial dimensions of religious life.
You have raised so many questions, and I hope we're going to address a bunch of them. But I think before we get to talking about, religion in these communities, we really need to talk about the people who made up the communities. Mm-hmm. So now that we've talked about geography, let's talk about the people. Okay. Would you tell us about the post-revolution New England migration into northern New England and why thousands of New Englanders chose to move from established places like Boston and Andover and places in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island into less established areas like northern New England?
Well, the choice was a little bit forced. Think about the end of the American Revolution. The United States was just in this downward economic spiral, and that had really begun during the war. The continental currency had crashed toward the end of the war. There was rampant inflation, plus debt, both public and private debt. In addition to that, the United States had virtually no manufacturing base, and so it was running a huge trade deficit. And there was an economic panic on the order of the Great Depression that would last for a decade. And so with the end of the war came this profound sense of dislocation. People were losing their jobs. Unskilled laborers were being, cut out of the market. Farms went into foreclosure, right? I mean, if you think about the crises that led to the regulation movements in Massachusetts in the 1780s, like Ely's Rebellion and Shays' Rebellion, this is exactly the world that they're coming from. And so a lot of people just had to move, right? And so out of desperation, they moved north, where land was cheaper and towns were growing. And then there were other panics in the mid-1790s. There were panics, in the first decade of the 19th century, in 1819. And whenever that happened, the same patterns typically followed. And so what did all of this migration look like in northern New England? Well, for one thing, people didn't just sort of pick a nice spot and move there, right, and uproot themselves from Massachusetts or Connecticut or wherever and go. These were people who were already living on the margins. And so they tended to move repeatedly. They leased land. They hoped to make a go out of it, which frankly is not very easy if you're a hardscrabble farmer. This is a place with bad soil and a short growing season. So much of the fertile land in the major river valleys had already been claimed by longer-standing and more prosperous families, so people were just kind of taking what was left and looking to farm somewhere or pick up a trade. And they crowded into these places, and there's one really memorable quote that depicts people, occupying caves and caverns where bears wouldn't even think of living because they were so desperate for something. And a lot of this migration was regional. They'd go up to Vermont or they'd go up to Maine, then they'd move somewhere else within Maine, or they'd move to New Hampshire and then back. And so a lot of it was regional. A lot of it was local between towns in an area or within a county or between a couple of counties. And so the numbers of population growth in these three states don't really tell the whole story of migration, because they don't tell the story of all the people who would pick up and move within a state, right, or would move back and forth between them.
Today, going on a trip to Vermont or New Hampshire, even Maine, sounds like a place of relaxation, but it does not sound very appealing in the late 18th, early 19th century.
No, not back then.
You raised the question of how does the physical geography of a place mesh and intersect with its spiritual geography? And it seems that one of the big problems that migrating New Englanders confronted was that their traditional town-church relationship or ideal was ill-suited to the physical geography of northern New England. So would you tell us about the tradition of the New England town-church ideal and why it didn't work well in the region?
Absolutely. So the town church ideal dates back to the New England way, which was really the religious system that developed in southern New England during the 17th century in these Puritan communities. And it basically meant that the town and the church were the same entity, with the same physical borders, with the same people. The underlying idea was that people who lived among each other naturally understood each other's spiritual conditions. They understood the states of each other's souls. They could act as a sort of organic community to bolster each other's piety. And so Puritanism, even though it was so much about the individual relationship between a person and God, was also about this community obligation to maintain, some sort of spiritual purity. So, there was this idea that a community with physical and spiritual boundaries belonging to one church, under one minister, was really important to everybody's well-being. Alternative churches were not welcome. Interloping preachers were not welcome because they would compromise the integrity of the community by violating the physical boundaries. So right from the beginning, the New England parish system was very much about space. It was very much about borders. And it was very much about belonging. But this system had a really hard time in northern New England because the physical circumstances of settlement were so different. There were places in northern New England that looked like these town churches of southern New England, and they tended to be the older, more prosperous, long-standing communities. But these new physical spaces that people were moving into were much, much more difficult. These were places where the physical and social geography of settlement made it very difficult for the town church to survive. And so I'm talking about tiny towns tucked into gorges, towns of hardscrabble farmers and transients who couldn't support ministers. And people actually said these things, that they were isolated. They didn't know their neighbors. How could they start a church with complete strangers? Right? It's the sense that you could really only start a church if you knew the people you were starting it with. And then there was also the religious diversity that was unprecedented for New England. The town church had depended not only on space, but also on relative unanimity. Now, that was an ideal in and of itself. There is no perfect past where, towns were completely unanimous, even though people imagine that there was. But that's how the parish system was designed. In northern New England, the religious scene was much more diverse, due in part to this influx of people from different places, and also due to the explosion of new denominations during the Second Great Awakening, beginning in the 1790s. And so all of these factors really put the parish system under enormous stress.
It seems like life in early northern New England is very isolating and lonely. And after you've now described the people who settled there, I can see why there was such panic in southern New England that these people in northern New England needed religion, they needed ministering to. So we know that they did try to get ministers up there. So could you tell us about what denominations emerge as key players for the souls of the northern New Englanders? And how did they compete for the settlers' attention if they live in such far-flung places?
Yes, well, I deal with 5 main denominations in the book. So they're the Congregationalists, who are, of course, the longest-standing settlers, the regular Baptists, who are the Calvinistic Baptists, and they're the oldest dissenters. And then upstart denominations, the Methodists, the Free Will Baptists, and the Universalists. So those are my main 5. There were others. There were lots of others, including Quakers, Shakers, the Christian Connection, Presbyterians, a few Catholics, Episcopalians, and so on. And they do crop up here and there in my book. But the reason I really focused on the 5 main groups that I mentioned was that I thought that they were really at the center of regional religious change in that area. They were all important in all 3 states. They fundamentally changed the methods of worship and religious organization. And then even more importantly, they saw themselves as part of a shared conversation. It was not always a friendly conversation, but it was shared. They saw themselves as competitors. They saw themselves as collaborators and really part of the same narrative of religious life. So, ministers may have complained about, say, the Shakers, but they didn't really see themselves competing with Shakers for the same turf. And so that's why I focused on those five and not so much others. Now, how did they compete for churchgoers? Well, for one thing, the Congregationalists kind of saw this as their home turf. This was an extension of southern New England. Most of the people who lived there had been in southern New England. Massachusetts, even in the 1790s, started a state-funded missionary society, the Society for Propagating the Gospel, which, sent missionaries up to Maine to make sure that people were going to church, to make sure that churches, the pulpits were filled on a somewhat regular basis. And so Massachusetts really saw themselves as having a state interest in making sure that religious life went on. But there was competition, and denominations competed in several ways, one of which was preaching. The Second Great Awakening brought a lot of people to favor and prefer a very dynamic and emotional evangelical style of preaching, with the idea of sparking conversions. Print culture was another way that people competed for parishioners. Most of these denominations raised money by selling tracts and periodicals. Part of the point was to attract readers who would then become churchgoers. Newspapers especially allowed people to share news, to share religious culture across distance because they were reading the same things and they were discussing them over correspondence. Missionaries and itinerants were a hugely important strategy. These were traveling preachers, and all denominations had them, some more than others, but they helped start churches, they administered the sacraments, they guided revivals, and the idea was to really keep people in the fold. Bureaucratic organization, as dry as that sounds, was really crucial too, because that was how denominations managed to administer a lot of people over a large area. They kept tabs on their ministers. They made sure of doctrinal consistency. And then there are really two different systems of bureaucratic organization. The Congregationalists and the regular Baptists used an association system, which would basically be local associations of ministers. They would often sponsor missionary societies. And then the Universalists, Methodists, and Free Will Baptists used a hierarchy of meetings. And so to take the Methodists as the classic example, they'd have the class meeting, which was really more like a Bible study group in confessional that would meet weekly. And then there would be the monthly meeting, which would be the churchly community, the quarterly meeting, the annual meeting. And so layers of organization allowed the Methodists to have this centralized control over the denomination, even as it sprawled out across distances. And there was constant communication between people at different layers. Denominations also used new rituals, like concerts of prayer, which frankly wasn't new, but it was sort of revived. I guess that's more accurate. But it would be a specific day each month that would be widely publicized, where congregations all across the region would know to pray at that time. And sometimes they would pray for a specific purpose, like the success of missionary work or abolitionism later. And sometimes they would just pray, but the idea was that you knew that people all around were praying, even though you couldn't be in the same room. Others included camp meetings, Methodist rituals like that, like washing of feet or the love feast and so forth. Revival was another major strategy that all of the denominations used. And that really intersects with a lot of the other categories I've already mentioned. It was an effective recruiting tool because it allowed you to count numbers of converts and formally bring them into the faith, but it was also just a genuine period of religious fervor and excitement that got people really attached to specific denominations. And then in some cases, denominations attracted and retained people by setting certain standards for behavior that were usually higher and more strict than in surrounding society. And so, for example, dress codes, modest dress, prohibitions against alcohol, prohibitions against amusements like dancing or card playing or gambling, prohibitions against reading novels, which were very scandalous in the early 19th century. Even the Free Will Baptists required their members to write in simple prose and not the flowery prose that was a convention of the early 19th century. And, so even something like that, and I actually read a meeting journal in which somebody was chastised for writing in prose that was too flowery and too extravagant. And so those were the kinds of things where if you bought into that and if you were a member of that denomination and if you participated in the very visible and tangible restrictions that they set on you, then you set yourself apart from worldly society and you identified yourself before all the community as a member of that group. And so that gave you a sense of community and a sense of spiritual pride. And so all of those devices work together to minister to people, to church people, to compete for people, and so forth.
Now, this must have been an exciting and yet stressful time. Stressful in that these people are religious and yet they may not have a formal minister, but exciting in that there's all this activity to try and get them a minister and get them ministering to. So there are social activities that actually bring them together with other people who are located in the frontier region. Mm-hmm. And I would like to talk about the itinerant preachers and revivals, but something you said and something I read in your book struck me as interesting. Now, you said that Massachusetts had a state-funded program to send ministers to northern New England. Mm-hmm. And in your book, you stated that each New England state had laws that required residents to pay a tax to support their local town church, which, often proved to be congregationalist, but sometimes something else. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, doesn't a tax used to raise money to support a local church violate the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States?
No, it didn't. And here's why. Until the passage of the 14th Amendment, with its due process and equal protection clauses after the Civil War, so this is the 1860s, civil liberties guaranteed under the Bill of Rights really were only guaranteed by the federal government. And so the United States government, Congress, could not have passed some kind of a religious tax, or they could not have taken some other action to promote or protect religion. But states could do it, and states did it. State establishments in the early republic were very inconsistent. Some states, like Virginia, just completely abolished any trace of their colonial establishment law. But many states abolished religious taxes, but kept other provisions like test acts, which gave certain groups, whether Christians or Protestants or Trinitarians or however they define them, more voting rights, for example. Many, many states kept Sabbatarian laws that required a minimum level of Sabbath attendance, and some states did keep religious taxation. And the question here was not so much a matter of liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience was universal. It existed everywhere. Rather, it was really a question of religious funding. A lot of people were really anxious in the aftermath of the American Revolution because so many traditional social controls were eliminated from American society. There was no monarchy. There was no aristocracy, and so on and so forth. And now there was no nationally established church anymore, although in the colonies that had always been very weak. But without all these social controls, how would Americans maintain social order? How would the republic remain virtuous, right? And so that was what people were really genuinely concerned about. And so some people hoped that by maintaining religious taxation, by helping to maintain churches and keep ministers in their pulpits, they would help support public morality. Now, those who were opposed to religious taxation, and there were those who argued fiercely against it, said that if people had complete freedom to choose which church to attend and whether to support it financially, then the nation would see a resurgence of dedicated, fervent Christianity. Those people who supported taxation said, everybody is going to starve out the churches if they don't have to pay. We don't make them pay, they're not going to pay. Well, it turns out that the people who were opposed to taxation were right. Just as the states were gradually demolishing religious establishments, the Second Great Awakening took hold, the numbers of denominations and churchgoers and converts exploded, and churchgoing was stronger than it had ever been, certainly in North American history. Now, New England was the last region to give up establishment, with the exception being Rhode Island, which never had it. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle not just to take away, the Congregationalist safety net, but also to give up on the town church system, that parish system. Because really, again, the issue was not freedom of conscience. The issue was the preservation of these town parishes and the kinds of religious communities that they supported. And so geography and space were really important. The idea was that if you had towns that were divided, what would happen? Right? What kind of society would that produce? And so there were ways to get around paying the tax to support a minister of a church you did not attend. There were ways to get exemptions. But it kind of depended on the goodwill of the town clerk. You could go up to the town clerk and say, okay, well, I'm a Baptist and I don't want to support the Congregationalist church. The town clerk could ask you, well, do you attend a Baptist church? Well, maybe there wasn't any nearby and you didn't. Are you a convert to baptism? Have you actually undergone the conversion experience to become a full church member and full communion? Well, maybe you hadn't. Maybe you just affiliated with the Baptist church. And then the town clerk would say, well, no, you're not a member of the Baptist church. You're going to continue to pay these taxes. And so there were struggles on those kinds of questions. The other thing that could happen was that dissenting churches could break off from the town parish to form what was called a pole parish. A pole parish did not exist in space. It did not have borders. It did not have land. It simply meant that people could belong to it and they would pay their taxes not to the town church, but to the church that had this pole parish. But it also meant that congregation, this dissenting congregation that started this break-off parish, it wouldn't have any claim to town resources, like the meeting house, like the plot that was supposed to, house the minister and that sort of thing.
So really, New Englanders use religion to order society, and the idea of disestablishing churches from society must have created a picture of anarchy in their mind, which is how they viewed northern New England.
Absolutely. Well, among some people. I mean, a lot of people did support it. A lot of people said, if you give people the choice, they will do it. I mean, it's almost like if you build it, they will come, right? If you give people the choice, they will support churches. And they'll do it even more because they're doing it of their own, their own pious impulses. If you require it, then you're going to have this, kind of weak religious culture, and nobody's going to really be all that enthusiastic because they're forced. And so that was the question. What would get people in the churches? Would it be forcing them, or would it be giving them the freedom to choose?
Let's transition here and go back in time and look at the itinerant preachers and the religious revivals. What type of men became itinerant preachers, and what was their life like as an itinerant?
Not easy. It really depends on the denomination. If they were Congregationalists, they generally came from middle-class homes, not always, but often, or higher up, and they at least had a college education. In terms of training, there really wasn't a difference between Congregationalist missionaries and Congregationalist settled preachers. For a long time, men who wanted to become Congregationalist ministers really had two options. They could go to Harvard or they could go to Yale. And many of the missionaries that I encountered had gone to one of those schools. But during the early Republic, other institutions emerged, partly to just cater to a population that was on the move. And so those institutions included Williams College, Middlebury, Bowdoin, and others, plus some other smaller academies and seminaries. And men increasingly chose colleges that were closer to home because they could. Now, also, in the first decade of the 19th century, Harvard veered much toward liberal Congregationalism and then toward Unitarianism. And so men who preferred a more Orthodox and Calvinist theology, a kind of new divinity theology, went to Andover. And so that was another alternative that accounted for doctrinal diversity within Congregationalism. Many Congregationalists who became missionaries planned to do it only for a short time as a kind of community service. Some did it to supplement income if their home churches could not pay them a full salary, and others chose more or less permanent careers as missionaries because they believed they could reach more people that way. Right? So those are the Congregationalists. As to the other denominations, their itinerants were on average less educated and poorer than Congregationalist missionaries, although even then we don't want to cast too many generalizations, but if we were to cast one, that would be one. Now, obviously, there was a wide range, but there were fewer colleges for people who sought to become ordained in those denominations. Those who did seek a formal education usually learned in academies or small seminaries. And some of the denominations, like the Methodists, were busy establishing these kinds of academies throughout northern New England to cater to these missionaries in training. But many people in these denominations actually felt that too much education would get in the way of what they called heart religion, which is a sort of emotional, intuitive religious sense, rather than the religion of the intellect or the head religion. And so they didn't always trust educated ministers, and they didn't trust that they were true Christians, and they thought they were too rational to really have become converts. And so anyway, these other denominations, itinerance experiences varied widely. But we can look at Methodists as a useful case study because they're so well documented and they're so systematic about everything. Their local preachers and circuit riders would always be on the lookout for good preaching candidates, and they would bring them up through the ranks. And so Methodist preaching candidates would go through these long probationary periods where they would basically be like a circuit rider's apprentice. And they would be evaluated based on how well they knew doctrine, how well they could preach. And then at conference meetings, there would be a time when presiding elders would discuss preaching candidates. They would review their performance. It was a performance review. I mean, I said this was a bureaucracy. I wasn't kidding. And those who met the standard would be certified and ordained. Methodists ordained preachers in their conference meetings. They were not ordained in their churches like Congregationalists were. And then they would be assigned a circuit. Now, as a circuit rider, a Methodist preacher would be under the supervision of a district elder to make sure that he was preaching correctly at his assigned churches, and he was basically doing his job. So what was life like for all of these people? No matter what denomination they were from, their experiences were fairly similar. For one thing, they were on the road a lot. Methodist circuit riders stayed within their circuits, and a circuit would be, anywhere from maybe 7 to 12 towns, and circuits would change periodically. But most other missionaries and itinerants who didn't have specific circuits would embark on tours of hundreds or even 1,000 miles, and they would complete a tour in anywhere from 3 to 12 months, depending upon what their assignment was. They would stop in towns for a few days or a few weeks. They would usually be staying at locals' houses, not always people of their own denominations, which would be interesting. People could take in ministers for any number of reasons. Sometimes it was because they were generous. Sometimes it was because they're curious. Sometimes because they had a sense of duty. There could be any reason. And then they would be on the road again. Travel was always hard. In the spring and summer, snowmelt and rainstorms made roads just mucky and muddy and rutted. In the winter, snows made roads impassable without some kind of sleigh. There were footpaths through these steep mountain passes, and there were creeks that you might be able to travel with a canoe until they became impassable. And then you had to carry the canoe. So it was rough. Missionaries very, very often complained of illness. Methodist circuit riders seemed to die young with shocking frequency. Methodists even had a special category, which was sort of almost like an emeritus position, for preachers who had to phase out of circuit riding because they were just too frail and too ill to continue. So it was rough. Preachers had a difficult life. Traveling preachers had a difficult life, and it really almost didn't matter which denomination they were from.
Travel in early America is always an interesting subject. Like today we think when we want to move houses, we'll do it in the spring or summer. The weather's good. But at least the migrants who go to New York, what always surprised me is their preferred time to move is in the winter because they can load everything up on a sleigh.
Exactly. And I read a minister's diary where he wrote that almost exact thing, where he said, winter, it's cold, but at least you can use a sleigh and get where you need to go faster. The spring is the worst time to travel because of the snow melt and the mud and the rutted roads.
So where did these men preach from when they got where they're going? Are there churches in these towns that are just empty?
A lot of them have churches. There were church building booms periodically, and they came earlier with the Congregationalist churches, partly because those congregations had been there longer, and partly because they generally had town funds do it. And the Congregationalist church building boom was kind of clustered in the first decade of the 19th century. The others were a little bit later, maybe in the 18 teens and 20s. They really started building more churches. But a lot of people did not have churches. They used a meeting house or a townhouse if one was available, and if there was a local congregation of the same denomination who controlled one and just didn't have a preacher. Sometimes the meeting house was shared by several denominations, and they would divide up the time proportionately according to how many people of each denomination were in the town. And so maybe Congregationalists would get it 40% of the time, and maybe Baptists would get it 20%, and so on. But they preached in private homes a lot of the time, and even barns or fields or groves and sometimes schoolhouses, which was interesting. In Bath, Maine, there were some Congregationalists who were annoyed with the Baptists because the Baptists did not use the meeting house. They used the schoolhouse. And guess what the schoolhouse had that the meeting house did not have? A stove. And so the Congregationalist church had no heat. Congregationalist churches, I don't know if you've ever sat in an 18th century or early 19th century Congregationalist church, but they are not comfortable. And so anyway, the Congregationalists were worried in Bath that people would start drifting away from the town church and toward the Baptists just because they could get some heat. But it was really unpredictable where you would end up preaching. One other thing to keep in mind here is that preaching wasn't even necessarily the biggest part of their jobs. It was important. Very important, but that wasn't necessarily what they spent most of their time doing. If there was any activity that took up most of these missionaries' time, it was actually visiting the home of lay people, believers, non-believers, members of other denominations, what have you. Itinerants and, for that matter, settled preachers spent an enormous amount of time visiting people and chatting with them about all kinds of things, but especially about their beliefs and the states of their souls. And so it was how the itinerants helped gather communities by creating local bases of faithful and by really developing these relationships with them so that if an itinerant would come back to a region, maybe after being away for several months or even several years, he had these long-standing relationships with people already, and he could build on them and use that to help build community.
So let's talk about revivals. It seems that many Northern New Englanders wanted to attend a religious revival. Would you tell us what a revival is? Was it planned? What did people do there? What was it like to attend one? Why were these Northern New Englanders so excited about revivals?
Well, in the early 19th century, everybody was excited about revival, most everybody, and Northern New Englanders were no exception. So this book takes place during the Second Great Awakening, which is a period of revival and the blossoming of new denominations and the expansion of old ones. And it lasted, now people disagree on the date somewhat, but we can say that it lasted from about the 1790s, peaking by the 1830s and 40s. And so there were revivals a lot of places, and a lot of people wanted to attend them. For believers, revivals were just the pinnacles of religious worship and experience. These were intense religious gatherings with emotional preaching, sometimes lay preaching and exhorting, and they usually included or sparked or inspired a lot of conversion. Now, what a revival look like? The short answer, I think, is all of the above. They could take place in all kinds of settings. They could be planned or unplanned. They could be led by ministers. They could be led by lay people. Part of it depended a little bit on denomination. For the Congregationalists, their revival tradition reinforced their town church geography. And what I mean by that, it was all about the churchly community. It was all about these relationships between the minister and the parishioners. And so they generally took place in a church, within a congregation, under the leadership of a minister who they knew, ideally a settled minister, but it could be a missionary. And parishioners could sort of coax themselves and each other into conversion within this safe, close-knit community. This was very much on the model that Jonathan Edwards had developed almost 100 years earlier during the First Great Awakening. But revivals didn't always go that way, and the denominations that tended to prefer itinerancy also favored a more fluid and flexible model of revival, and this is one that dates back to George Whitefield, also in the First Great Awakening. Sometimes revivals would be sparked by the kinds of meetings that were usually on the calendar anyway, and so camp meetings, quarterly and yearly meetings, and so forth, some of them were planned to have a kind of evangelistic and revivalistic atmosphere. These were large gatherings. They were planned in advance. They were usually publicized in newspapers, and they would draw thousands of people. And so they would come from miles away. They might represent different denominations, but they would be expecting something, right? So they'd come almost primed and ready for this intense experience, and they carried the momentum of those expectations with them. And so ministers would preach at these revivals, but so could lay people, right? There were men and women. There were many well-known women preachers or exhorters who would travel the land. The difference between preaching and exhorting is basically the difference between what a minister would do and what a lay person would do. And exhorting was not so much teaching religion. It was more sort of confessing your soul and urging people to convert. And really, practically speaking, in a setting like that, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between them. But people would undergo these very dramatic and public and emotional conversion experiences. Some revivals could erupt spontaneously, or they could build momentum gradually. They might concentrate in one town or in one or more churches, or they might cluster among several neighboring towns, in which case the momentum might build when churchgoers in one town or maybe itinerants in the area would kind of go and travel between towns, and they would carry that fervor with them wherever they went. And so revivals could take many different forms, and they could erupt in many different ways. But the common thread that connected all of them was this emotional and spiritual intensity, the spike in religious conversions, and just the excitement that they generated.
Now, you mentioned the Second Great Awakening and that it was a time where there were a lot of new denominations forming and a lot of religious excitement. What caused this period in American history?
Well, it's hard to put down one cause, but you can talk about several that were kind of coming together. For one thing, people were coming out of the American Revolution and, the very tumultuous 1780s and into the 1790s. And a lot of people, frankly, were just worried about the decline in piety. And this is a concern that crops up everywhere if you start to read the pamphlets in the newspapers and sermons and so forth, that people are just very concerned about a decline of piety. During the American Revolution, people were distracted. It's not that they weren't religious at all. In fact, a lot of them really understood the changes underway in very, very religiously rooted ways. But people didn't have the resources to support their churches, and so a lot of churches fell into decline and disrepair. Communities, as I mentioned before, were very fluid. People were transient because of economic dislocation, and so people were very concerned. And so the thing about the Great Awakening is that its origins are very complex because it cropped up at different times in different places in different ways based on different denominations, right, and their styles. And so there was like a pre-Great Awakening called the New Light Stir, and it did happen to occur in New England Hill Country in the early 1780s. It was in sort of the hill country of Massachusetts and Vermont, New Hampshire. It gave birth to some denominations that were just kind of coalescing at the time, like the Free Will Baptists and the Universalists, who would become important, during the early 19th century. And so that laid part of the groundwork. And then also in the 1790s was the beginning of the New Divinity movement among Connecticut and Massachusetts Congregationalists. And the New Divinity movement was, in many ways, the most intellectual phase of the Second Great Awakening, but it happened among ministers who believed that Congregationalists should return to the orthodoxy of Jonathan Edwards in the First Great Awakening, and so they should return to this kind of more uncompromising religious sensibility, and that was a statement against this very rational and more liberal trend in Congregationalism. Now, not long after that, in 1800, you had the Cane Ridge Revival in Kentucky, which began as a Presbyterian communion season, but the Presbyterians who were organizing it invited the Methodists to show up, and it became really the prototype for a camp meeting, for a Methodist camp meeting. You had men and women preaching, blacks and whites worshiping together in the woods. They were camped out for several days, thousands and thousands of people, and these people were writhing on the ground and undergoing these incredibly emotional religious experiences. Well, the camp meeting became a template for religious revivalism all up and down the country. And I remember reading some diaries and letters in which people in northern New England said, "Have you heard about Cane Ridge? Have you heard about these revivals? I want to have a camp meeting up here." And lo and behold, the Methodists brought camp meetings to northern New England. So, I mean, if we're thinking about how the Second Great Awakening started, the roots are so spread out that they're almost difficult to isolate. But it was this reaction against perceived religious laxity, right, and blandness. And then the other thing that triggered it, I think, was disestablishment, right? When, as I said before, it turned out that when people had the choice to attend church or not, or to attend any kind of church they wanted and support any kind of church they wanted, boom, the whole thing exploded. And denominations, new denominations or revived denominations were cropping up everywhere. And that's definitely what happened in northern New England.
Well, thank you for putting that into context for us. Shelby, you have really painted us a picture of northern New England as a religiously anxious and kind of a disordered place in the midst of this Second Great Awakening. What is the epilogue to this? Does northern New England ever organize in its religious and physical geography, or does it always have a bit of unsettled nature to it?
Well, it does kind of settle out, and it settles out. Really, one of the big reasons is that people realize that, in fact, if you let go of the parish system, religion would survive. And so by the 1830s, which is really where my study winds down, what you have is a kind of settling of terms where different denominations are maybe sometimes still a little wary of each other, but they're not scared by each other, and they're managing to coexist. The parish system did not survive. This sort of town church ideal, that was the one thing that really didn't happen. Despite the efforts of the state to preserve those original town parishes, towns became so fragmented that the distinction between a town parish, a pole parish, and what have you really became meaningless. And so increasingly the different congregations in the towns, built their churches, or they maybe shared the town meeting house, or they split the income from the parsonage plot, which was often not even occupied by a minister. And they just kind of adapted. They saw themselves as friendly competitors most of the time. Sometimes they got into fierce doctrinal disputes, but most of the time they managed to do that. And the culture that emerged really was an amalgam of the local focus of the town church and the far-reaching focus of the itinerant system. Basically what happened is that not only Congregationalists, but also a lot of the other itinerant denominations, the Methodists, the Free Will Baptists, and the Universalists, really started to recognize the importance of having locally rooted ministers. And the Free Will Baptists said, okay, yeah, itinerancy is great for spreading the religion, but then how do you sustain it? And one of them even used the metaphor of a gardener. Like, it's great to have a gardener to sow the seeds, but then if he goes 10 miles down the road, who's going to weed the plot? And so they started to emphasize settling churches, not just starting them. And so there was a local emphasis to a lot of these denominations. At the same time, all of the denominations, not just the itinerant ones, added more and more layers to their bureaucracies, intending to help these denominations expand across space. So now we're at the time where we've got populations moving into New York, into the Ohio Valley, and all of the denominations in the study have missionary arms that are really, really focused on administering those far-flung populations. And so as it settles out, you really do have a kind of blending of cultures. One doesn't truly win out over the other.
Now that you've settled things for us, let's move on to the time warp and unsettle them.
Okay.
This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Are you ready for your time warp question, Shelby?
I am.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the physical geography of northern New England had been more similar to that of southern New England? How would our nation's religious geography be different if it had been easy for the Congregationalists, Methodists, Baptists, and the other denominations you studied to establish congregations in northern New England communities?
Well, I think we have a little bit of the clue to that answer if we look at some of the earlier northern New England communities. Southern New Englanders, when they migrated north, did look for areas that resembled the southern New England landscape. So these sort of broad river valleys and flat, well-drained soil for farming, or ports and fishing villages, and so on. And in those long-standing settlements, which predated the American Revolution for the most part, they did look more like southern New England religious communities. It was really later, when people started to settle in the more isolated and challenging regions, that things started to look different. So that's one clue. Another clue is that it wasn't just physical geography that was the defining factor, but it was also transience, right? The social geography, the flood of people, the fluidity of community. And that fluidity gave rise to the spiritual geography of the region. And so it was the persistent movement that might have happened, frankly, regardless of topography, and we certainly see it in other regions of the country. And then we also have to take a look at why these denominations adopted itinerancy. The Congregationalists, and to a lesser extent the Calvinistic Baptists, adopted it because they had to. But the Methodists and the Universalists and the Free Will Baptists adopted it because they thought it was the best way to evangelize and organize. They use those methods in other regions of the country as well, right? Not just the mountainous, unyielding regions of northern New England. And the Baptists quickly became one of the leading denominations in terms of domestic and foreign missionary organizations. So itinerancy really was becoming a fixture of American religious life nationwide, not just in challenging landscapes, right? It was becoming the way to transport and spread religion in all kinds of landscapes, in all kinds of backcountry regions, and indeed even other countries. So I'm not sure that New England's topography in that sense was the deciding factor as to whether or not to use itinerancy. And so what would have happened had northern New England been more like southern New England? I think that Congregationalists probably would have made more headway there, which would have made it harder for other denominations to gain a foothold. I think they would have been more successful earlier. It's possible that northern New England would have been less diverse, not more diverse, perhaps less connected to other early American frontiers because of that. The parish system would have been stronger and it would have lasted longer. Perhaps a group like the Free Will Baptists, which emerged first along the Maine-New Hampshire border, might have been stifled by the strength of the town church system. But I'm not sure that it would have changed other itinerant denominations' tactics elsewhere in the nation. And I think it's likely that those denominations still would have eventually spread west because they spread west from other places than New England. And I think they probably would have spread to northern New England eventually as well, but maybe not as early and not with as much success.
It's interesting because Americans still move a lot today. I mean, there's a population shift now towards the South. They used to go west. And it seems in some ways like we still have itinerants, only now they're televangelists. Their lives have gotten a bit easier.
Well, we do. The mega churches, one point I bring up in my conclusion is that if you want to look to the legacy of the system now, we do have a fluid population and we do have a population on the move. And one place that people go to create community when they move into these suburbs or these exurbs where they don't have community, they go to church. And these mega churches that are big and very charismatic and very appealing to a broad variety of people, invite them in. The mega churches also have kind of an interesting mix of local autonomy and this sort of larger association that sort of resembles an old itinerant hierarchy or bureaucracy. And so that is one legacy, right, of this period, that how do you guide people's uprootedness and how do you guide people's movement around the country? Well, one thing you do is provide religious institutions for them to join and create community that way. And the other thing that you mentioned, the televangelists, again, that kind of works in the same way as as print media did in the early 1900s. It's a way for people to forge common bonds across distance and to account for the disjointedness and uprootedness of everyday life if they have these common people and these common leaders that they can latch onto.
Well, before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
I can. I've begun work on a new book I'm calling tentatively Family Religion, Christianity at Home in 18th Century America. And it begins with this idea of family prayer, which is a fixture of American worship, not just among Protestants, also among Catholics, although they don't necessarily call it the same thing. It begins with the Puritans and their tradition of formal religious practice in the home. And so that included catechism, morning and evening prayers, pious discourse, reading sermons, reading the Bible, that kind of thing. And even though it had long been part of Puritan culture, ministers in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, began to call it by name. They started to call it family prayer or family worship. They started to publish guidebooks to encourage families to do it. And then casting forward into the 18th century, it became an important part of religious practice across denominations. And I think that looking at family religion will help me get a sense of spiritual life outside the institutional church, especially considering how race and gender and mastery shape life in the household, and households included not just parents and children, but also servants and slaves, and so they would be in the mix as well. Right now I'm actually working on one of the later sections of the book, I'm starting it at the end, looking at ministers' calls to families to revive the practice of family prayer after the American Revolution. And you can see how anxious they were about irreligion and its effects on the Republic. And these ministers tended to fuse together Christianity and republicanism and patriarchy in ways that they called upon families to strengthen the nation's spiritual foundation. So I think there's a lot of good material to mine there, and I'm just really getting started.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating project, and we wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you.
Where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Okay, well, if anybody would like to get in contact with me or learn a little bit more about my work, I have a website, shelbymbalick.com. And then they could also find me on my page on academia.edu or my department page at Metropolitan State University of Denver.
And we'll have links to those pages on the show notes page for this episode. Well, Shelby, thank you so much for taking us on this journey of religion in Northern New England. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, and thanks for talking to me.
Our conversation with Shelby has me thinking about just how difficult frontier life during the early Republic was. When Shelby told us about the lives itinerant preachers led, I was struck by how great a challenge it seemed to be just to travel to the town next door. I was also struck by just how much religious fervor circulated around the United States during the Second Great Awakening. Thanks to Shelby's descriptions, we now have a sense of what revival participants could expect to see or experience when they attended revivals during the 19th century. And we have a better sense of why rural men and women wanted to attend revivals, regardless of their religious leanings. Revivals meant a temporary end to the isolation they experienced with their rural lives. You can find information about Shelby, her book, Rally the Scattered Believers, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/030. Did you know that I have books to give away? Occasionally, the publishers of our guest historians send me extra books just to give away. If you would like more information about how you could obtain a free book, please visit benfranklinsworld.com, sign up for the Franklin Gazette newsletter, and click the link in your confirmation email to join Poor Richard's Club, the official social community of Ben Franklin's World listeners, and the place where I will announce details about how you can receive a free book from one of our upcoming or past guest historians. Have you told your friends, family, and fellow history lovers about our podcast yet? Please tell someone you know about Ben Franklin's World and how much you love it. Word of mouth recommendations are still the best way for us to increase awareness about Ben Franklin's World and help us keep the podcast visible and findable for our fellow history lovers. Finally, do you think about rural life in the early Republic? Do you still have questions about how people lived and worked in these isolated and underdeveloped areas? Email me your thoughts, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.